Have you ever wondered why loneliness seems to hit harder after the age of 60? Why, even when people are around, there are moments when the silence of your home feels heavier than it ever did before? The answer runs much deeper than simply lacking company. There are powerful, invisible psychological forces at play, forces that build slowly over the years and make loneliness feel inevitable at this stage of life. What's truly alarming is that this loneliness doesn't happen by chance. It takes shape silently, fed by small choices, by emotional patterns we never learned to see, let alone fix. Science has uncovered these hidden psychological triggers, and understanding them is the first step toward breaking the cycle that traps so many people in isolation as they grow older. Research shows that chronic loneliness can increase the risk of premature death by up to 29%. We're not just talking about a passing feeling, but a real, measurable threat to the brain, the heart, and even the immune system. Yet here's the surprising part: feeling lonely often has little to do with how many people are around us. More often, it's shaped by what's happening inside our minds. In this video, you'll discover the 6 most common psychological reasons why men and women over 60 feel more alone than ever before. More importantly, you'll learn exactly how to break free from each one of these invisible traps before it's too late. You'll meet 2 characters whose real-life stories will help you see these patterns clearly, and maybe even recognize yourself along the way. You'll witness how loneliness disguises itself as pride, stubbornness, or even a false sense of self-sufficiency. And by the end, you'll hold the knowledge you need to reclaim your emotional health, because life after 60 should never feel lonely. Now tell me, are you ready to face what no one ever told you about loneliness after 60? If you are, comment number 1 below, and stay with me until the end. One of the most silent, yet devastating, psychological traps that feeds loneliness after 60 is the loss of identity that follows retirement. For decades, your profession shapes how the world sees you, and how you see yourself. You're the teacher, the doctor, the craftsman, the business owner. Every handshake, every introduction, every sense of pride, all tied to what you did. Then one day, it's over. There's no clock to punch, no responsibilities waiting, no one calling your name. What remains is an unsettling question. Few dare to face, who am I now? Robert knows this feeling all too well. For over 40 years, he was Robert Miller, the electrician everyone in town trusted. He wore that title with pride. But when he hung up his tools for the last time, something in him quietly unraveled. Without the work that once defined him, Robert found himself adrift. No longer needed, no longer certain of his place in the world. At first, he told himself it was just the adjustment period, but weeks turned into months, and that empty feeling became his new normal. He stopped calling old clients. He ignored invitations from former colleagues, because deep down, he felt invisible, and nothing felt more painful than realizing the world no longer saw him the way it once did. Thomas, on the other hand, faced the same crossroad, but chose differently. As a school principal, his days were once filled with decisions, responsibilities, and people who depended on him. Retirement hit him hard, but Thomas understood something that Robert didn't. Identity can and must evolve. Instead of shrinking back, Thomas created a new role for himself. He became the local library's volunteer, the mentor to young readers, the grandfather who still had wisdom to share. In shifting his focus from what he did to who he could still become, Thomas protected himself from the emptiness that consumed Robert. Science backs up this difference. Studies show that retirees who create new roles, goals, or social identities maintain stronger emotional health and are less likely to suffer from loneliness and depression. It's not about denying the past, it's about refusing to live only in it. Loneliness after 60 often doesn't begin with isolation. It begins with emotional withdrawal. And the cruel irony is that this withdrawal feels at first like protection, a way to avoid pain, grief, or disappointment. But slowly, quietly, it becomes the very thing that builds walls too high to climb. Robert knows this feeling intimately. After his wife passed, grief hit him like a wave he couldn't fight. In those early days, friends called, neighbors knocked. On his door, his children checked in. But Robert, proud and hurting, found it easier to say, "I'm fine." Easier to shut down the conversations that dug too deep. Every time he avoided talking about his pain, every time he chose to stay silent rather than risk breaking down, he pulled a little further away from the world. What began as self-protection turned into habit. Weeks became months. The calls came less often. The visits stopped. And Robert, now convinced no one truly understood him, mistook his own emotional withdrawal for proof that he was alone. But the truth was, he was the one who'd been pushing people away all along. Thomas faced grief too. The death of his wife left a hollow space no one could fill. But Thomas made a different choice. He allowed himself to mourn, not just privately but openly. He cried in front of his daughter. He told his book club friends, "It's a hard week." And in that vulnerability, something remarkable happened. People leaned in, not away. Psychologists call this the paradox of vulnerability. We think that showing pain will drive people off. In reality, it's what pulls them closer. Studies show that those who express their emotions, even their grief, maintain deeper social connections and recover faster from loss. Thomas's willingness to stay open kept his world from shrinking. Robert's fear of appearing weak became his cage. One of the most dangerous traps people fall into after 60 is mistaking routine for safety, believing that sticking to the same predictable rhythm protects them from the unpredictability of life. At first, it feels comforting. Waking up at the same hour, drinking coffee at the same kitchen table, watching the same news channel, walking the same path around the block. But what begins as harmless routine slowly hardens into isolation. Days blur together. The world shrinks, and without even realizing it, many lose the very thing that once gave life meaning. New experiences, fresh conversations, and the subtle joy of the unexpected. For Robert, this became his new reality. After retirement and the loss of his wife, he carved out a daily routine so rigid it became a cage. He wakes up at dawn, reads the paper, fixes himself a simple breakfast, and sits in his worn armchair, staring out the window, watching the seasons change. The same routine every day. He tells himself it's peaceful, that he enjoys the quiet, but the truth is, it's not peace he feels, it's numbness. Opportunities to break that cycle disappear, a neighbor's invitation for coffee, a local event at the community center, but Robert always finds a reason to say no. "I'm too tired today," or "maybe next time." But next time never comes. What he cannot admit is that the routine feels safer than facing the fear of being out of place, of realizing how much the world has changed while he stayed still. Thomas, however, knows the seductive power of routine and the risk it carries. After his wife's death, he felt the same pull toward quiet repetition. But Thomas forced himself to do one simple thing: say yes. Yes to the library's request for help. Yes to the neighbor who invited him to a weekend farmer's market. Yes to attending his grandson's school recital, even when he felt like staying home. Science has a name for this: behavioral activation. The intentional choice to engage in activities that disrupt isolation. Studies show it's one of the most effective ways to combat depression and loneliness, especially in older adults. Each yes strengthens the neural pathways linked to joy, connection, and emotional resilience. Thomas's world remains open, filled with new faces and small adventures. Robert's world shrinks by the day, his routines turning into silent walls that no one, not even his children, knows how to break through. Perhaps one of the most destructive lies people tell themselves after 60 is this: it's too late for new friendships. On the surface, it sounds harmless, maybe even logical. After all, lifelong friends have history, shared memories, a bond forged by time. How could anyone new possibly understand who you are, what you've lived, what you've lost? But this belief is more than just a passing thought. It's a silent surrender, a decision that closes the door to one of the most powerful human needs: connection. Robert tells himself this every day. What's the point? He thinks when he hears the neighbors laughing on their porch or sees people gathering at the cafe downtown. They already have their groups, their inside jokes. I'd just be an outsider. And so, he stays home. What Robert doesn't see is that every time he repeats this belief, he's reinforcing the very loneliness he dreads. Studies show that the brain, especially in older adults, responds to repeated thoughts, carving neural pathways that make beliefs feel like facts. Over time, Robert isn't just thinking he's too old for new friends. He believes it, and that belief isolates him more powerfully than any locked door ever could. Thomas, too, faced this moment. Standing outside the library his first day volunteering, wondering if he'd made a mistake. He was the oldest person there. The younger volunteers chatted easily, unaware of the weight Thomas carried. He could have walked away, but instead he stayed. Awkward, unsure, but willing. Weeks passed. Names became faces. Faces became friends. And Thomas learned a lesson Robert never did. Friendship isn't bound by time. It's sparked by presence, by shared moments, by simply showing up. Psychologists have long studied this, known as the mere exposure effect. The more often we see someone, the more likely we are to feel connected. It's not magic, it's science. Consistency builds comfort. Comfort builds trust, and trust builds friendship. Thomas's circle grew not because he was lucky, but because he dared to believe there was still time. Robert, convinced his window had closed, never saw the doors, opening right in front of him. There's a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when pride stops being a virtue and becomes a prison. It happens slowly, especially after 60, when the body starts betraying what the mind still feels capable of. Tasks that once felt simple become harder. Asking for help crosses your mind. But something stronger rises to stop you: the fear of becoming a burden. For Robert, this fear has shaped every decision since his wife died. The arthritis in his hands makes fixing things around the house nearly impossible now. But rather than calling his son, rather than admitting he needs help, Robert tells himself, "They're busy. They have their own lives. I don't want to bother them." What he doesn't see is that this silence isn't protecting his family. It's cutting him off. Every time he hides his struggles, he denies his children the chance to show up, to feel needed, to connect. Pride tells him it's dignity. But in truth, it's a slow, silent surrender to isolation. Thomas wrestled with this too. The first time he struggled to lift the heavy groceries from his car, he felt the sting of shame. But instead of retreating, he made a different choice. He called his daughter, and when she came, smiling, grateful to help, Thomas felt something shift. That simple act reminded him that family ties aren't a burden, they're a bond. And research proves this. Older adults who ask for and accept help maintain stronger family relationships and experience less loneliness. It's called intergenerational reciprocity, the natural cycle of giving and receiving that deepens emotional connections. The truth is, asking for help isn't weakness. It's an invitation, a chance to remind your loved ones that you still matter, that you're still part of their world. Robert's pride keeps him silent, watching from afar as his family moves on. Thomas's willingness to be vulnerable keeps him connected, not just as a father or a grandfather, but as a man still living, still needed. There's a harsh truth few people speak about when it comes to aging. Social skills, just like muscles, weaken with lack of use. And the more time passes, the harder it becomes to bridge the growing gap between ourselves and others. For Robert, this erosion was so slow he barely noticed it. In his working years, conversation was part of daily life, chatting with clients, joking with coworkers, discussing the weather at the hardware store. But retirement changed that. Months turned into years with fewer reasons to talk, fewer people to listen. And now, when a rare social moment appears, a neighbor at the mailbox or a quick call from his daughter, Robert stumbles. He doesn't know what to say, how to fill the silence. Awkwardness creeps in. Ashamed, he pulls back even further, convincing himself it's easier this way. Easier to avoid people than to face the uncomfortable truth that somewhere along the way, he forgot how to connect. Thomas felt it too. The hesitation, the rusty small talk. But instead of letting the discomfort drive him into isolation, he faced it head on. He read, he listened, he practiced. He made a point of joining conversations, asking questions and staying curious, even when it felt unnatural. What Thomas understood, and Robert didn't, is that social skills don't vanish overnight. They fade quietly until one day you find yourself a stranger in your own skin. And science confirms this. Studies show that reduced social interaction shrinks the brain's social cognition network, the very area responsible for empathy, understanding, and connection. But the good news, just like a muscle, this part of the brain can be strengthened again at any age. Thomas rebuilt his confidence one conversation at a time. A chat with the librarian, a question to his neighbor, a story shared at the book club. Each moment, small on its own, formed a bridge back to connection. Robert, trapped by his growing discomfort, watched his world shrink, not because no one cared, but because he forgot how to meet them halfway. Loneliness after 60 is rarely about the number of people around us. It is a slow, invisible build, the sum of choices, fears, and beliefs accumulated over a lifetime. What begins as small withdrawals, a little more silence, a skipped gathering, turns into years of disconnection. And by the time we stop to look around, the world feels foreign, distant, unreachable. Robert's story is not unique. In fact, it mirrors the quiet suffering of millions who wake each morning feeling unseen, A man who once fixed homes and lit up rooms now sits in silence, imprisoned by pride, routine, and the belief that it's too late to change. Each day, he tells himself it's safer this way, that needing no one means never being disappointed. But deep down, his heart knows the cost. Thomas's life could have followed the same path. He had every reason to retreat: grief, aging, the temptation of comfort, but he chose every single day to lean into the discomfort of connection, to risk the awkward moments, to ask for help, to say yes when his instincts screamed no, and because of that, his world remains wide open, full of faces, voices, and the quiet comfort of belonging. What these two men teach us is simple, yet hard to live. Loneliness is not a destiny. It's a consequence, and just as it's built, it can be dismantled. One choice, one conversation, one brave moment at a time. The science is clear. Human. Connection protects the brain, strengthens the heart, and extends life. But beyond the data, there's a deeper truth. We were not meant to live or die in isolation. So now, the question is yours to answer. Will you follow Robert's path, slowly fading into the background of your own life? Or will you find the courage to be like Thomas, to reach out, to speak up, to let yourself be seen once more? Because the door is still open. The time is not gone. And no matter what your mind whispers, it is never too late to live fully, to connect deeply, and to remind the world and yourself that you are still here. If this journey made you reflect, if you see yourself, or someone you love, somewhere in these words, I want you to take action. Comment below, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notifications, because this is just the beginning. Together, we break the silence. Together, we reclaim what it means to truly live after 60.